Hi, Steve Smith here again. Welcome back to another of my sessions about teaching languages. And today the focus is on teaching vocabulary. A reminder of my Twitter handle at the bottom there and my blog where you can find all sorts of posts written over the course of about 10 years and my links site to interesting readings, podcasts and videos about language teaching. If you want updates on these recordings, then subscribe to the YouTube channel. And there should be something here of interest both to new teachers and to veterans. So today's session is a little bit like the one I did back in session 6, if I recall, about teaching grammar. It's a little bit on the theoretical side. But as usual, I think if you have some understanding of the sort of underpinnings of your work, then that can help you enhance your practice or maybe just confirm that you're doing things in the way that you want to do them. So here we go. Now, there's a very famous quotation in the literature about vocabulary, and it comes from David Wilkins, who was actually a lecturer of mine at Reading University back in the 1970s. And he said, without grammar, very little can be conveyed, but without vocabulary, nothing can be conveyed. And so the first message here is actually how important vocabulary is. It is more important than grammar, both in terms of being able to produce language and to understand it. I mean, to be able to recognize words and phrases is the most important skill in reading and listening, and also being able to quickly retrieve them from memory when you need to speak or write is also vitally important. So to start with, vocab is right up there as an important area of second language learning. So knowing words is really important, and it's been shown that there's a correlation between the size of vocabulary and your general proficiency level, so perhaps no surprise there. And the research shows that vocabulary knowledge is also a strong predictor of general performance in all 4 skills. And it's been found that just the number of words you know can explain up to about 50% of the variance in a student's performance. But of course, knowing words isn't just knowing what they mean. All of these 3 factors, breadth, depth, and fluency, if you like, automaticity, speed of recall, are all important. And that's been researched on, for example, by James Milton here from Swansea University, whose input has been used on the ncelp.org site, the National Centre of Excellence site, which I've mentioned to you before, and which I'd suggest you go and have a look at sometime. So when we talk about breadth, depth, and fluency, well, breadth is simply knowing lots of words. How many do you know? But it might mean that you just know them superficially. For example, you know what they're spelt like, or you know what they mean, but that's all. Depth is really important. So knowing words in more contexts, knowing the company they keep, the words that go with that original word, knowing the different forms of that word. And so the more that you learn words in different ways, the more often you encounter them, then the bigger your depth of vocabulary knowledge will be, as well as your breadth. But also what's called fluency here. We're not here talking about the sort of fluency of speech. We're talking about the speed, the automaticity, the ability to quickly recognize and retrieve words for use. Paul Nation, who I've mentioned in previous presentations, suggests that you need lots of exposures for words to be known and for fluency to develop. He mentions between 5 to 20 encounters in his book on vocabulary learning in 2001. I suppose key takeaway is here, you need to use words in lots of contexts for them to be memorable. So you need both frequency of exposure and memorability of exposure. Paul Nation talks about what does actually knowing a word mean, if I can take this a little bit further. In the diagram here, which is from his book, he divides vocabulary knowledge into receptive knowledge, i.e. being able to recognize words and chunks, and productive knowledge, can you retrieve them and actually use them? So he divides knowledge into three areas: form, meaning, and use. So the sort of things you have to bear in mind are, in speech, what does the word sound like, and how is it pronounced when you actually have to say it? We've talked previously in the listening presentations about how important it is to know what words sound like for phonological memory and to be able to pick them up in the sound stream. What does the word look like? And also in productive terms, how is it written and spelled? And so on. I won't go through all of those for you, but I'll just give you a few moments just to scan down and have a look. The essential takeaway here is the complexity of what knowing a word means. And the more that you can develop all of these different aspects, then the greater your breadth, depth, and fluency of vocabulary knowledge will be. So, key points about vocabulary acquisition, and I showed you a picture of Paul Nation. Here's Joe Barcroft, American scholar involved in vocabulary acquisition. And the general stuff we can take away from research is that most vocabulary in the long run is acquired incidentally. You just pick it up through input. But research does support explicit vocabulary teaching, and this is most important for beginners. So anecdotally, when I was teaching my youngsters in their first, second, third year, then I would have been doing more flashcard work, more explicit teaching of words and translations and so on. But by the time they'd done 6 or 7 years, I actually did no vocab testing, no specific vocabulary learning, and they picked up their vocabulary and developed their fluency simply from lots of listening, reading, and interaction. There are teachers who take a different view and who think that it's still worth doing vocabulary tests for the older learners, but it didn't seem to be necessary to me. The priority should be about presenting vocabulary in the input. So not just, if at all, giving words individually, word lists to learn and so on, but showing vocabulary in actual sentences and spoken utterances. One thing to keep in mind is a little bit of research about themed vocab lists. This is interesting. I mean, the research is not very powerful on this, but it does suggest that if you learn words by theme, for example, let's say you learned lots of words to do with clothes or fruit and vegetables, for example, there is some evidence from cognitive psychology that this can create what's called the interference effect between words, and that therefore they will be less memorable than if you simply introduce words, for example, fruit and veg, in different contexts, rather than trying to teach them all at once. I point that out to you. It's a matter of interest. I mean, that research is not very powerful, but the NCELP, for example, do mention it and suggest perhaps it's something to avoid. I am aware that there are plenty of teachers out there who actually believe strongly in themed vocab lists and feel that students benefit from them and like the satisfaction of knowing all the words in a particular theme. One argument against it is that you end up teaching too many obscure words. So, for example, if you wanted to do fruit and veg, you might end up, teaching things that maybe aren't so common, not just apples and pears, but maybe avocado and curly kale or who knows what. I would say this: if you're going to do themed vocab lists, don't go overboard, because you do risk teaching words which aren't high frequency. Key issues are clearly repetition, spaced learning, and memorability. And just be wary of too much isolated word learning. If you just learn words from lists in vocabulary tests, or using an app such as Memrise or similar, the danger is that you might get some breadth of vocabulary, but you don't get the depth that you need to be able to recall and use it quickly. So, in general, and according to the Teaching Schools Council Review 2016, which I've mentioned to you before, you can find that on the NCELP site, vocabulary to be taught should be informed by frequency of occurrence in the language. So you teach high frequency language. But, you have to keep in mind, don't you, the syllabus that you're teaching to, and sometimes, you're forced to teach words that are in the syllabus. But even so, if you're smart about this, you'll prioritize the high-frequency, useful language, and perhaps not worry so much about the more obscure words, because what's more important is to have good mastery, depth of knowledge of the vocabulary rather than a sort of superficial coverage of words, including words which are less important. High-frequency verb forms and verb chunks are certainly to be recommended. So a big focus on verbs rather than just nouns. And something I alluded to earlier on there is a danger when you do a topic-based course that you end up teaching too much specialized vocabulary rather than just focusing on the high-frequency stuff. So if you have a textbook and you feel it's leaning too much towards the more specialized stuff, then you can always do a cull yourself, can't you, and select what you think is important. So frequency of occurrence with words is really important. In a review of the literature by Gu in 2003, you can just read that if you like. Quite clearly, we forget words really quickly, and this has been confirmed by many, many studies, and it goes back to the work of Hermann Ebbinghaus, the German psychologist back in 1885. You might know him from his forgetting curve. So we know that we recall words less and less quickly. You have to keep coming back to words and chunks on a repeated basis, not just over 3 or 4 lessons, but over weeks and months. So that has clear implications for your curriculum, your scheme of work, and your timetabling in terms of how you spread out and plan for your teaching of vocabulary. In addition, it's been suggested by some researchers that the learning of vocabulary, like any form of learning, is effective when it's interleaved with other activities. So rather than doing massed practice, so cramming a load of words for a test the next day and then leaving them behind, far better if you reintroduce those words every now and again, mixed in with new learning. In fact, interleaving is really just follows on naturally from spaced learning, because you do have to introduce new things as you go along with your course. And if you're then reintroducing older material, you're constantly going to get the interleaving effect happening. In a way, this might seem less satisfying for students, since you don't get that immediate reward, if you like, mastering your word list for a test. But in terms of long-term memory, then interleaving makes most sense. Making words memorable is important, isn't it? Not just the frequency, but how memorable words are, how distinctive. So vocabulary is better retained when it's taught in some sort of memorable context. And Chameau there, for example, showed that when learners engage in deeper processing of words, for example, ordering them in mind maps, they will retain them better than when they're presented just in a learning list. So how memorable can you make the words? So if you're teaching words, have you got good pictures? Can you do great gestures? An example of making something memorable would be if you were teaching parts of the body to make exaggerated gestures when you're pointing to certain parts of your body and so on. So anything that makes stuff memorable, any connections you can build. Implications of this, maybe it's more interesting for students to learn chunks or full sentences containing that vocabulary rather than learning isolated words. It's certainly something I'd recommend myself, and some schools do with great success. So rather than a list of 10 or 15 words to learn, how about giving them chunks with the words in, or even full sentences, so that the sentences need to be memorized? That's going to give more communicative bang for your buck, isn't it, than learning a list of words. And ultimately, for many students, it's a bit of a chore, word learning. It's a bit dull, and it's probably the main reason why I was not a huge fan on the whole. So we mentioned how important it is to process words in different ways. This is called elaborate processing or deep processing. And the psychology here is that the more complex you can make networks in the brain, involving both the sounds of the words, the spelling, visual images, gestures, smells, whatever it might be, the better learners will remember. There is clear research on the benefit of teaching words with pictures, for example. That doesn't mean not using translations, of course, but pictures do seem to help. And there's been some research, for example, Mayer and colleagues compared memory performance in 3 learning conditions: reading only, reading in pictures, reading and performing related gestures. And actually the gestures came out best in that particular research. So, as well as your pictures, think of mime and gesture, whole body actions that can help people store words. So from this brief trawl of the literature and what we know from research about vocabulary learning, I've just put together some key words, if you like, that sum up essential points to keep in mind. So you could even self-test yourself here and ask yourself, what was meant by incidental learning? What does fluency of vocabulary recall mean? What do you know about forgetting? What's the importance of chunking and elaborate processing, and so on? We'll deal with some more practical stuff in future sessions, but I hope you found that interesting and learned something new there. The references I used there are all listed there, so if there's anything you want to follow up, there are 1 or 2 freely available things. Wherever anything is available online, I've referred to it there and given you the website address. And if you go to informedlanguageteacher.com and check out the section on vocabulary, there are lots of links there that you could follow up, all of which are freely available to you. And in particular, you might want to check out this presentation on vocabulary from the NCELP at the University of York. So go into their resources section. You just have to register your name. There's no cost or anything like that. It asks you whether you're a teacher or an educator or whatever it might be. And then you can do a search in there, and there's some good general stuff on vocabulary. And to finish off, there's a reminder of the books I've been involved in. So most recently, Breaking the Sound Barrier, where in Chapter 4 we look at lexical retrieval and the importance of vocabulary for listening. I've got a section on vocabulary in Becoming an Outstanding Languages Teacher, perhaps more aimed at the beginning teacher or less experienced teacher. And also we cover vocabulary in reading in our handbook, The Language Teacher Toolkit. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you can join me again. Next session is going to be about reading. Bye.